Today's episode is brought to you by the Reese Hotel in Queenstown. Now is the time to book your 5-star hotel stay at the Reese Hotel in Queenstown, proudly New Zealand owned and operated. With stunning lake and mountain views, courtesy town shuttles, a private beach and jetty access, and staff that'll blow your socks off with their impeccable service, it's definitely not your average weekend getaway. Guests can experience the talents of Chef Corey Hume at True South Dining Room for some exquisite locally sourced produce, or their lobby bar with the award-winning wine cellar bursting with local and international vintages, or simply work your way through their cocktail list. Perhaps if the mood strikes, break out the in-house Bentley Continental for a quick lakeside spin, or an airport pickup with a difference. The video you're seeing now, I took over the weekend with my stay up there. This is the view from one of their balconies. While all the rooms come with balconies and heaps of space to enjoy these views, now is the time to book your weekend getaway with a special discounted price. Book now via the hotel website. That's the Reese, THEREES.co.nz. Use the promo code COVID-19, one word, to receive a special offer of 10% off any accommodation. That's thereese.co.nz and use the promo code COVID-19 for your getaway.
The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
She is the editor-in-chief for Reason magazine, co-host of the Reason Roundtable podcast, Katherine Mangu-Ward. Welcome to New Zealand. Kia ora and welcome, and thanks for coming on the DOC.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Very excited to have you here. My first question is going to be a little bit maybe pithy, but I was wondering, did you ever get over calling Bill Maher an old man? Did they ever end up badly after the shooting?
You know, they have I would say, a lively spirit on Bill Maher's show on HBO. And I think he dishes it out, but he can take it. So we'll see if I'm ever invited back, but it's certainly a fun show to be on. I suspect it might be a little similar to your show.
It's interesting. He didn't seem to take that very well. It sounds like you were joking around a bit, but also it's very strange. It's like you look at someone where they sit politically, their political views, their ideologies, and then when you chuck tens of millions of dollars into the fold, it's interesting how it all of a sudden doesn't quite work. Like, is he a capitalist centrist? Is he a far left guy? Some of his views, he's a really interesting enigma who is on the left, identifies as being on the left, but sometimes when you hear him speak and you hear what comes out, it sounds very much more sort of capitalist conservative. And that must just be the influence of money. I mean, it's an influence I think we all hope to have one day, but it's an interesting dynamic when you throw that into the pot.
I don't think it's necessarily money. Over the years, he has described himself from time to time as a libertarian, which is how I describe myself. And I think that he has some claim to that title as well. In the U.S., because we have this tendency to force people into one of two boxes, right? You're a liberal or you're a conservative. You're a Democrat or you're a Republican. I think Maher doesn't fit well in those boxes, and I think Reason magazine, which I'm the editor of, and just speaking for myself, I think those boxes are kind of inadequate, and I'm always interested in people who shake those categories a little bit.
Yeah, it is a bizarre system looking at the American system from other parts in the world, that it's so binary. For the country, and this is not to throw shade, but for the country that says it's the kind of icon of democracy around the world and stuff, to say to people, now you've got two choices, and this time around they're both utter horse shit, but the other two you've got. And it also seems that in America, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you're the expert in this because you're there, that it's a bit like sports fans. You're either a Democrat or a Republican. It's like, are you a Bears fan or are you a Yankees fan? Yeah, it's like a really tightly held on to. I must fit into this square box. I don't know about all other parts of the world, but certainly here in New Zealand, I mean, I think we've got 5 different political parties in government at the moment, and because of COVID, our our centre-left party got in with a majority, and it's the first time we've had a majority government, meaning more than 50% of the vote, since pre-1996. Every other election since then, there's been a coalition have to be put together of at least two parties to make up a government to get across that 50% threshold. So it does feel like a very foreign concept, that binary offering you guys have.
Yeah, I mean, I do think people's political tribe is often part of their identity, and that leads to some pretty bad outcomes. It shouldn't be that the person you vote for is also who you are as a person. In a best case scenario, in the U.S., we just do our coalition governments before the fact rather than after the fact. So our Democratic Party is basically some quite left-leaning progressives, some of whom would call themselves democratic socialists, as well as people like our president, who is a moderate center-left, old school liberal, what we would call a liberal here. And that's, those are almost two totally separate parties that just happen to be living under the same label. That creates all kinds of tensions, including what we've been seeing here for the last several months, which is a government that is dominated by a single party, but can't do stuff because that single party is barely unified, barely agrees with itself, and needs to try and build some support across the aisle to get stuff done and can't.
Do you think it's always been like that, with the two parties having different factions within? Because, was it 2014 that the Tea Party popped its head up? That seemed to be a really easy identifiable point where I'm going to call them the far right. They may call themselves something else, but certainly a, say, uber conservative faction, and quite high numbers came out. And I guess now you're seeing that again with the MAGA group within that Republican Party. It feels like when you're talking to, or looking at, I don't talk to, but looking at, hearing maybe more traditional Republicans speaking, they're saying it wasn't like that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been, dissent and dissension within the parties. You can go back to the American founding and see brutal, bitter internal warfare, even before the parties gelled as parties, and then certainly after that as well. I think there is this temptation to golden ageism. I think everyone has it, but this idea that there was some moment of harmony. There was some moment when men were men and women were women and all the children were above average, or whatever it is, and that was never, that's never real. And at the very least in the US, you can be totally confident that it wasn't real for underrepresented groups, right? I mean, maybe there was some moment of harmony among white male landowners, but even though that's not as substantive as we would like, and even that I think is a fiction. So I always take the view, as much as I possibly can, that things are getting better. And I think that's sort of undeniably true, that in most ways, things are better now than they were 200 years ago. Things are better now than they were 50 years ago. I have become persuaded that this particular problem of political polarization is genuinely worse in the United States right now. And I think around the world, but in the US is what I know best. And the thing that I'm basing that on in part is a series of quite alarming survey results, which show that Americans are increasingly willing to break the rules of politics because they think the other side has already broken the rules. So, procedurally, in terms of, how we handle our elections and voting rights, in terms of, would you want your son or daughter to marry a person with a different political affiliation? All those numbers are going in the wrong direction. All those numbers are going quite dramatically in the direction of mutual disdain, in a way that I think is real and is really worse than it has been historically.
And that sort of makes sense looking from the outside in, because so often you look at a political, let's use the Supreme Court nominees as an example. You look at a party that says, oh, no, you can't nominate a Supreme Court nominee in the last term of an election. And then they just completely flip. And it's so obvious to everybody that there's hypocrisy there and they know what they're doing. But if you take the position that you have already wronged me, rather than you are going to wrong, you've already wronged me. Then me being a hypocrite doesn't matter because I'm actually correcting a wrong that's already happened, rather than me being a hypocrite that then you have to correct that wrong. So if you've already wronged me, I can do whatever I want and justify it because you've wronged me in the past, whether you have or haven't. So that kind of makes sense as well, from what you see from the outside, at least.
Well, and what it gets you though is this schoolyard dynamic, right? I mean, it gets you into this absolutely absurd fight about who started it. And, that couldn't be less relevant, but it's, the thing that is really problematic, the thing that worries me a lot is in attempting to pursue this answer of who started it or somehow in justifying, process violations, rules violations, mistreatment, just really, really harsh rhetoric. If you believe the other guys started it, but both sides believe that, there's no way out. And I think this is one reason that as a libertarian, I'm not on either of the teams. Like, I'm genuinely just not red team or blue team. And it puts you in a position to really see that they can't both be right? Like they cannot both be correct, that the other side is evil and wishes America ill. And if they have their way, all will be lost. Because I share some of the views of the left and some of the views of the right. I think there are better ways to put together some of those ideas, and people are choosing not to do it because their affiliation to their tribe is stronger than their desire to find something that actually is like functional that we can use to move forward.
Yeah, I echo what you're saying. Like 10 years ago, more than that probably, I wrote a piece called Intelligent Debate versus Ideology. And the point that I was making is, who thinks that they are right or correct 100% of the time? And no one would say that. So therefore, sometimes your ideology must be wrong. And what if this is the case where your ideology is wrong? But when you're in a sports team, you always want to win. You always want to get that W. You're always the best team. You've always got the best quarterback. You've always whatever, because you're in that tribe. And it's funny the way you bring it up. I've come back to that piece I wrote probably 20 times, maybe once every 10 podcasts, because it seems so relevant, because it is that I'm not always right. So why would I think my political ideology is always right? That can't always be right. And if we start from a position of maybe it's wrong this time, I wonder if we'd have different discourse. I actually rewatched World War Z last night with Brad Pitt, mostly because he's gorgeous. But I rewatched it, and I picked up on a really interesting thing they did. I don't know if you know the movie or know it well.
I do. I also read the book, actually.
Oh, cool. All right. Yeah. Okay. I watched the movie. I'm a schlob. They talk about, people who don't know the movie, it's a zombie invasion of the world, basically. But Israel is safe for a while from the movie, from the invasion. And Brad Pitt's character goes to Israel, and he goes, "How did you guys know?" And the Israeli guy he's talking to says, "We intercepted, communication." And he goes, "I don't buy that. I don't buy that you intercepted a communication, and that was enough to get you to set up to be prepared for this thing that was coming in the future." And he explains something called the 10th man. And I thought it was amazing. And I thought, gosh, it would be so interesting to bring this into my daily life. And the 10th man is a theory that if there are 10 people in a room and 9 of them all agree to what the outcome is or what the situation is, what the evidence is showing, then the 10th man must disagree and then research that disagreement to see what he can find. And I thought in politics, that would be so interesting, because if you had that 10th man theory where people can sit back and go, "Hey, what's the counter side here, guys? What's the other perspective, and what are they trying to do? And maybe we should research that." I wonder how that would work. I might be being a bit naive saying that that's a possibility, but it was, when I saw it in the movie, I went, that's a really interesting way to approach, I guess, all sorts of aspects of life.
Well, and that's how adversarial judicial system works too, right? I mean, we have this old-fashioned term, the devil's advocate. And I think sometimes people use that derogatorily, right? They always stop playing devil's advocate, be serious, this is important. But the whole idea of the devil's advocate is essentially the idea that all people, or maybe in your example, all ideas or all possibilities deserve defense, that you need to sort of bring into the conversation a serious effort to see the other side. I also sometimes think about this as like an ideological Turing test. So, the idea of the Turing test is that if you build a machine and interact with it, and those interactions are indistinguishable from the interactions you would have with a human, the machine has passed the Turing test. It is Turing complete. And there's a lot of research about our ability to do ideological Turing tests. Can I give you a compelling account of what a person I disagree with, like, what do they really think? Not a dismissive characterization, but like really truly try to put yourself in that person's shoes and see if you can build the case from their perspective. And when people do that, they're more likely to get to compromise. They're more likely to, have empathy for people who disagree with them. They tend to kind of turn down the volume and the temperature on their political rhetoric. And I think that's really valuable. I think a lot of that is unfortunately missing these days.
I used to work in talkback over here in New Zealand, talk radio. And I used to often say that, because, in talk radio, it's a pretty ugly group of people that phone up, and they're all very level one conversations. And, they heard a politician saying it, so it's truth, or they heard a pastor saying it, so it's truth, or they heard a whatever. They've taken one source of information and it becomes truth. And I used to run the and then what theory. And then what? So something would happen, and they'd say, well, we need to move those welfare bludgers out of that house that's in my neighborhood. And I'd always go, so then what? So then you've got the solo mum with 6 kids, on the street, in a house next to someone else, in a car at the end of your driveway, then what? What's the flow on effect? And it used to actually delve down a little. You never get too deep with a talkback call, but delve down a little bit deeper to try and get them to go, well, let's find a solution here. And I also do this quite a lot when I'm talking to people about, COVID's obviously a big issue at the moment, but when I'm talking with someone who I know has a completely contrarian view to me, I say, are you prepared to have your mind changed? Like, are you prepared to move in your position at all? And if they say no, I go, well, I'm not looking for an argument, so we won't worry about it. And it's not unless if they say yes, I'm like, cool, let's hash this out and see where we can get to. Because I know that if given the evidence, or I'm able to be given something to research, I'm prepared to change my mind on subject X. But if you're honestly not, if you're entrenched in it and you're not prepared to change no matter what, then what you're looking for is an argument, not a kind of conversation or a debate or something. So it's interesting how to find that middle ground, or at least come to it, even when you can come to a place to agree to disagree. That's always, I think there's a skill in that.
That's actually just because I'm a political journalist, because I think a lot about how to make good public policy. One thing that I think is an undervalued way to deal with disagreement, especially in politics, is to agree that this is not something for the government to solve, to agree that it's something that's not the business of public policy at all. And I think that's it seems to have been a forgotten way to get out of some of these sticky situations. So, I think you can say, for instance, I think it's very clearly bad for people to smoke cigarettes, right? Like, it's bad for you. I think that. Okay. I want to smoke cigarettes. I think it's bad for people to smoke cigarettes. What are we going to do? Well, one answer is we have to either make cigarettes illegal, or they have to be allowed everywhere with no restrictions. And the government is going to have to make every rule about that in every place, in every time, for every person. And another answer is, okay, people have different preferences on this. And even if something is clearly demonstrably scientifically bad, right? Like, smoking causes lung cancer, that is a true thing. We don't have to solve this problem at the level of the federal government, at the level of the national government. That doesn't have to be the place where we answer this question. And maybe we want to allow individual businesses or individual homes to decide whether smoking will be allowed there. Maybe we want to encourage smoking alternatives. And so we want to speed up the approval process for safer alternatives. Maybe there's a bunch of middle ground if you just let go of the idea that the entity that has to resolve conflict is the government at the highest level. And I think that's a little different from the thing that you're describing, which is how do we change people's minds on an interpersonal level? That's still everybody's business all of the time, but that's consensual. That's voluntary. That's just you and me agreeing to talk or decide about it. I think it gets into a different realm. To solve this problem once and for all, it has to be one solution for everyone. And people who don't like that solution, we're going to use force to bring them into compliance, whether it's jailing them or fining them or whatever it is. To me, that should be a pretty small list of topics that we deal with in that way, and a much bigger list of topics that we deal with in your way, which is like, let's you and me talk and just try to see if there's anything we can do to come to agreement or compromise.
I think that it's also not necessarily just the idea of changing someone's mind, that concept that I was talking about. It's also the idea of just conversing as well. Like, I don't often get into conversations with people and going, I'm going to change your mind because I have all the answers. I'm just like, I don't know. Sometimes you ask people yardsticks or you ask people various questions and it gives you an indication of what they do and how they operate in other areas. I mean, obviously it is a way that you can change their mind if they're open to it, but just even conversing with if someone's closed, even conversing with them about a topic without wanting to change their mind is, it can get pretty old pretty quickly. But the smoking thing is interesting as well. I wonder if in America that concept is easier to follow through to the nth degree because of your healthcare. Because all of the other, because you pay for it, right? So if you smoke and you get cancer at 53, then you're fucked if you don't have healthcare. It's on you. Other parts of the world, though, where that doesn't quite work as well, like here in New Zealand, we have a free healthcare system. So if you smoke and you get cancer at 53 and there's $250,000 worth of healthcare you need because of that, then that becomes more of a collaborative cost and a cost to the government. Does that make any difference? Like, is America really the only place you can have pure libertarianism? And for people who don't know, the way I think about libertarianism, correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of the least government intervention. I mean, libertarian, it comes from the Latin word meaning literally freedom, I think, doesn't it? So it's the least amount of intervention from the government as possible. But as I say, I wonder if in America you can attempt to have it in its purer sense, but places around the world that has more like socialized healthcare or more aid from the government to the people, then it could become a government issue because decisions that people make do impact the government coffers, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very common argument, and I don't think it's wrong to grapple with that. At the same time, I would say, listen, I think that people have certain rights, right? There are just certain things that, just by virtue of being a human being, you are allowed to do, that you retain the right to do, and that even if you live in a place with policies that complicate those rights or infringe on them, it doesn't mean you don't have those rights. It just means that it's more difficult for you to exercise them or realize them. So one example here is, I am very pro-immigration. I think that one human right is the right of free movement of people and of goods. But let's talk for a minute about people. So in the United States, it's true, we don't have nationalized health care, but we do have a variety of welfare programs. We do have, public schooling. We do have social safety nets. And so there's some people who say, well, listen, I would love to let people in to our country, but we can't because, we have this big welfare state. And so when people come here, they're imposing a cost on other people. Now, there's a lot of empirical research about whether or not immigrants ultimately are a net positive or a net negative for a country's economy. But setting that aside, let's assume it's true that at least initially, when people come, they're more likely to consume social services and so impose costs. I would say, yeah, so maybe we should think about how we're administering our welfare policies or whatever it is. But I don't think that means that it's okay to violate people's right to free movement. I think even though the cost of immigration is higher because of other policies that we have, it's still really important to honor people's rights to move about freely. So I think you can say, listen, there are baseline policies that make giving people, their rights and freedoms, the ones they deserve, they make it more expensive. They make it more politically difficult. But I don't think that just because there is one policy that imposes costs, that shouldn't necessarily mean, well, then it's okay to, violate people's freedom. I mean, I could, say, for example, the war on drugs, right? Which I think has been a disaster. I think it's been totally ineffective in its stated goals, and it's imposed enormous costs. And, people would be right to say totally unchecked drug use might have a lot of social costs. It might really be tough for some people. I would say my right to bodily autonomy and other people's right to, to do what they want with their bodies still exists, even if those costs exist. And we have to balance that. We have to take that seriously. And so, in circumstances like the smoking example, the drugs example, the immigration example, of course, we're going to talk about costs and benefits, but I don't think the final word is your bad behavior cost me money, therefore it's cool for me to make your bad behavior illegal. I just don't think that's how it should work.
Did I describe libertarianism accurately enough? That kind of freedom, least a government intervention as possible?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different ways to describe it. My elevator pitch has evolved over the years. I used to say socially liberal and fiscally conservative, right? So what that meant 15 years ago in the United States was something pretty specific, which was socially liberal was, I don't care what you do with your body. I want you to be able to, marry who you want. I want you to be able to, go where you want, live with who you want. I want your civil liberties to be respected. I want you to be able to say what you want. And fiscally conservative used to mean, I don't think the government should spend money it doesn't have. I don't think the government should spend a lot of my money. I think that, the government should take seriously its role as a steward of taxpayer money, is maybe a way to say it. However, in the year of our Lord 2022, the American conservatives have totally abandoned fiscal discipline. They really don't care. They spend just as much money as the left. And American liberals have increasingly abandoned their commitment to civil liberties and are much more willing to see infringements on speech rights, are much more willing to see infringements on other kinds of, personal choices like religious affiliation that they think are not cool. So I don't know if that makes sense anymore. I still think that those two ideas paired together are really powerful, but it doesn't maybe land the way that it used to. Something like very limited government. I also sometimes say libertarianism is just about maximizing choice. We just want people to be able to freely choose for themselves as much as possible.
It's kind of a little bit echoes what I asked about. You hear a Republican who was a Republican in the 1970s and says it's so different today. I had David Goldberger on the podcast not too long ago, who's a lawyer for the ACLU. He was one of the guys who defended the Nazis in the 70s in the Skokie case. And I had him on talking about, I'm paraphrasing here for the sake of dramatic effect, but he was talking on basically saying, what the fuck is happening to the ACLU at the moment? So it's an interesting dynamic change. But I guess in society we do that, don't we? I mean, there's that old adage that if you're not, liberal or progressive or whichever word you want to use, when you're young, then you've got no heart, and if you're not conservative when you're old, you've got no brain. But I think even though that's an oft repeated, I guess we would call it a meme these days, I think the truth is what we've got is each generation that comes after us is more liberal, more to the left. So in other words, me as a Gen Xer, the Gen Ys and millennials and the Gen Zs look at me and think, look at that fat old conservative dick. Whereas my politics certainly sits in the left, but compared to theirs, I'm basically a conservative boomer, and who will come after them is further to the left. So I don't think that repeated meme is correct, but I think there's truth in the fact that the younger you go, the more liberal you get. And I wonder what that means for the future and where that's going to go from here on in as well, because that's what I hear people saying about like David Goldberger, and and you hear some of the more traditional Republicans saying, what are these young Republicans up to? What does it look like now? It's a shifting, the sands shift, but I guess that happens in society no matter what we do. And then eventually we find some solid ground in that society for a while, and then the sands shift again, and we move society, and then we find solid ground, and then the sands shift again.
Yeah, I mean, I I also hate that quote, not least because I've never really identified with either of those categories. And so, what is that? Am I chopped liver? But I think that I think that you are right that sort of what that is getting at is that both as individuals age and also as generations pass, people do redefine this political terminology, and they redefine themselves in relation to it. I think that there is some natural conservatism that comes with age. It's sometimes you can say, oh, well, I didn't change, but the world changed around me. And I think that can be true, but it's also true that as you get older, your perspective on some of these things can shift. I wonder though, this polarization that we were talking about earlier, this tribalism, I wonder if it makes some of that shifting self-identification harder. If you say who I am as a person is a liberal, who I am as a person is a conservative, people don't tend to change their self-perception a lot as they get older. I'm 41 and like, I'm cooked, right? Like you can put a fork in me because I'm done. Like it seems like I am unlikely to have a radical political awakening after this point in my life. That's just generally true. People's music taste also doesn't change, right? Like it's not just politics.
Yeah.
So the more of our identity is wrapped into our politics, the more difficult it's going to be for people to grapple with political changes. And I do think that could be a problem going forward, because already I think in the US, the two parties are kind of much more style than substance in many ways. And my guess would be that trend is likely to increase if people's self-identification is tightly tied up with their party affiliation. I guess on the other side, though, there are polls that show that an increasing number of Americans just say that they're independents. They just don't affiliate with a party or even with an ideological label nearly as much as they used to. I have two colleagues, Matt Welsh and Nick Gillespie, who wrote a book called The Declaration of the Independence, and it was about this phenomenon, about how it might be good, like that people might be moving away from party affiliation. So I think that could still play out in a way that is sort of a countervailing force with the polarization.
That idea of being like affiliated to a party is something that seems quite American as well. Like I think in other parts of the world you hear about, I vote to the left, or I'm left wing, or that kind of. But they don't often say, like, I don't know anybody in New Zealand. So our major party is the Labour Party at the moment, the left, centre left, and then the Greens are further to the left of them. I don't really know anybody who goes, I belong to the Labour Party. There are, because there is a ground. There are citizens who pay subs, and that does happen. But comparatively speaking, I literally can't think of a single person that I know personally who is a paid up member of a political party.
Yeah.
They may vote National, which is our centre right, or Labour, which is our centre left, or Greens, or ACT, or Māori Party. But I don't know of anyone who is a paid up member. And if they are, it's not on a badge on their shirt, or they don't adhere to, let's say, pandemic scientific information because of it. So yeah, it seems to be more of an American thing as well. Not a criticism, I'm just saying interesting observation. Yeah. And I was thinking, as you were talking about, tying up in our identity, that with maybe millennials and Gen Zs, so we say Z, you say Z, Gen Z, that there's a lot that those two generations seem to be adhering to or determining for themselves as lifelong changes now, really pushing into an ideology or a tribe that I don't remember when I was that age thinking of, this is me. Like maybe I just don't remember very well. Maybe, it's that maybe I was too busy playing basketball, cricket, and, hanging out with my friends to worry about what tribe I was in. But it feels that you're talking about a political affiliation, that the generations to come are putting themselves into other kinds of affiliation now that feels like they're saying this is me forever, and they're 25 or they're whatever. And I'm sure that did happen when I was 25. I don't recall it as being as strong as it is now. But I wonder about that as well. You say you're 41. I'm in my 40s as well, a little bit older than 41. But it took me till I was 40 to fucking figure out who I was. In fact, literally 40 was a big year for me to figure out who I was.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this place, we are both arguably Gen X.
Yeah.
I'm maybe borderline, but I identify as Gen X. And I think that, you know, there are plenty of good critiques of generational cultural stereotyping, and those critiques are fair. Like, there's obviously nothing magical about being born in 1982 versus 1979 or whatever it is, but we came of age at the end of history. I mean, there was this term, right? This Francis Fukuyama wrote this book, and it was about how, you know, the Cold War is over and the kind of great conflict for the future of humanity perhaps has come to an end. You know, we are a secular, decadent, but capitalist and globalist world, and that's where we are now. And history, you know, the great battles of history are over. That is an unfair characterization of Fukuyama. He has written many essays over the years saying that is not what I meant, but it's what people took away from the essay. And I very much felt that when I was in college, there was nothing to do a protest about, or people didn't feel that way. It was before 9/11, which obviously was a big breaking point in the US, but even so, you know, I think we did have this sense that, like, my politics are not who I am, because politics aren't that important, because it's like, what's even happening there? There's no movement on these issues. And I think people do rightly feel that there is movement now, that we have sort of resumed history. History is back. And, you know, we're all kind of in the old, may you live through interesting times curse. And so that does make politics feel higher stake to younger people. I will say, though, even though younger people do have stronger political stereotypes, I guess, they also hate the political parties. Like, I've never met anyone under the age of 25 that's like, you know what's going great? The American Democratic Party. Like, I love it. That's awesome. Like, and same with Republicans. Like, I think people do have an appropriate detachment from the parties, but I would say Gen X had like an ironic detachment from politics, and
right.
And that millennials and Gen Z have more of like a angry and disgusted approach to the status quo, at least.
I like that idea about, you know, coming up at the end of history, because someone said to me a wee while ago, and you're probably in this situation now, I was just trying to do the math, that I'll say it to you because I'm well past this date for me. But when I realized that point, that the day I was living in today, right, that the years I had lived past my birthday, so to the age I was longer than the years prior to my birth to the end of World War II.
Oh, yeah.
It freaked me out.
That type of math is terrifying. I feel you on that.
And I mean, I do this all the time now. Like, you know, my kids are watching a Toy Story movie, and I realize it's approaching 30 years old or whatever it is in the early 90s. And I think about that. I did it with my parents once, and because obviously the gap gets wider and wider and wider, it's like they were born closer to the start of the Boer War was closer to their date of birth than today was. And it really shows you how much history there was in that kind of, let's say, 100 years up to the 1970s, how much was packed in there, how much important stuff as well was packed in there, but how that history is yesterday. You know, it really does feel like yesterday. Like, I think about my kids now, you know, we've got Netflix and Amazon and Apple Plus and Spotify, and I'll hear one of my kids singing a song from the 80s when I was at high school. And I'm like, how do you know that? And they're like, oh, yeah, it's on my playlist. And I'm just like, whoa. And watching movies from the 90s. And I think about me at their age, that would have been me watching a movie from the 50s. I never watched a movie from the 50s. That was old and ugly and ridiculous. Whereas my kids now watching a movie from the 90s or even from the 2000s when they were around is 20 years ago. But I didn't do that when I was a teenager. A, I didn't have the ability to do it because of technology. But B, if it was a Saturday afternoon and some, you know, other than Cliff Richard Summer Holiday, love that movie, but some, you know, Elvis movie came on, something like that before my time, I wasn't even slightly interested. So they also have such access to a vast amount of knowledge, and it just speaks to me again about that when you said end of history, how I feel like history was yesterday. You know, 1992 it feels like yesterday to me because I'm an old fart, but also it looks like yesterday because if I want to go watch a movie from 1992, I've probably got 3 platforms on my TV upstairs that I can pull one up from. You know, so that means it's still relevant. It's still today. 1992 is still today because of the stuff that's in my Netflix catalog.
I also think, though, there's this phenomenon that's easy to kind of underestimate. Humans' brains are wired for a basically static world. For many generations, our ancestors' lives were virtually identical to their parents' lives. And it's only really in the last, let's say, 200 years that we are living in a world of really, really dramatic change. And I think that coincides with basically the rise of global capitalism, right? And what happened 200 years ago? Great question. I think it's like a very, very complicated, multifactorial answer. But it is true that if you look at what the world was like in 1820 versus now, per capita income was like 10x what it is today, or it was 1/10 of what it is today. 85% of the world was living in what we would call absolute poverty. Today, it's something like 8%. Literacy went from being, 10% of the population to illiteracy being 10% of the population in that period. And so we are, our sense of whoa, history is moving too fast, I think is an accurate one compared with our baseline, our sort of the way that we're wired, which is to expect things to always be the same. I think we have this feeling of vertigo or this feeling of speed around us because the world is changing fast. And I personally think it's a good thing. The natural condition of humanity is impoverished and full of suffering and death. And let's not do that if we can avoid it. But it does create this sense of kind of dislocation and sometimes kind of anxiety.
I had a friend of mine once say, and I mentioned this 2 or 3 times on the podcast, and I think about it often, that we live in a world where we've never moved this fast before, and we will never be this slow again.
Yep.
Because it just keeps on going.
I mean, the other people who felt that way were the Victorians, right? And I think about this all the time because I think there is kind of this neo-Victorianism that's happening right now. There are a lot of people who have the, sort of a high technology Victorianism. We still have very traditional mores, particularly in the kind of upper classes, the wealthy people. We have, we're still very family centered. We have, rules, etiquette, politeness, all these things. But the Victorians, had this feeling that the world was speeding up almost out of control. And they worried a lot about the people that had the levers of new technologies, right? So rail, telegraph, the sense that things are all about to spin out of control is not a new one to us, but it is, when you go back and read a Sherlock Holmes story or something, you can really see that same sentiment in there of, these women riding their railway cars to the hotel, who knows what's going to happen? Their uteruses are going to fall out and, society will fall apart. There's always fears that come with change.
I wanted to ask you another couple of things about the libertarianism conversation, but also let's also show people where to find out more about you and what you do. Reason magazine. Now, is Reason? I'm sorry for the naivety of this question, but is Reason magazine a physical magazine as well that you can turn the pages, or is it all online?
It is. Reason magazine is more than 50 years old, and it has been publishing as a magazine during all that time. It's a monthly magazine. So we do put out a dead tree version every month. We also have the website, reason.com, which is what you're seeing here. And we have videos on YouTube. We put out, couple D3 videos a week. Some of them are mini documentaries. Some of them are interviews like this one. Some of them are comedy videos. We also have a whole slate of podcasts and newsletters as well.
So there's the Reason Roundtable as well, which is the one that you're co-host on. Let me read it out. It says every Monday, the Libertarian editors of the magazine of Free Minds and Free Markets, Matt Welch, Nick Gillespie, Katherine Mangu-Ward, and Peter Suderman, forgive me if I got any of those names wrong, discuss and debate this week's biggest stories and what fresh hell awaits us. I listened to the episode about Joe Rogan, because didn't we all listen to the episodes around Joe Rogan? Because I had a actually, you went to Yale, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. I had a Yale professor on last week, Dr. Stephen Novella. He wrote a piece on the media algorithm around Joe Rogan. So I had him on. He's a neuroscientist. I don't know if you know of his work, but he was great. Had him on last week talking about Joe Rogan. So I was fairly ensconced in Joe Rogan content last week. It's all very interesting. What I wanted to ask you a bit about, to do with the libertarianism as well and what goes on, is so at the moment, let me bring that back up actually. At the moment here in New Zealand, as many places around the world, this is a live feed from our Parliament grounds at the moment, where we have one of those trucker convoy anti-mandate protests going on. We don't really have truckers in New Zealand like the rest of the world do, to be honest with you. We're a small country, but there was a convoy of cars and, I don't know, what do you call them, camper vans, Winnebagos, that kind of stuff, touring it from the top of the North Island down to Wellington, which is at the bottom of the North Island, the bottom of the South Island, up to Wellington. So meeting in the middle, and they've been there now. It's been like 12 or 13 days that they've been camped at Parliament. And because I was thinking about the idea of libertarianism and to be a libertarian, coming from the Latin word freedom, the obvious question is, and I hark back to when I was working in talk radio, I used to fairly often interview a guy called Rodney Hyde here in New Zealand. Rodney Hyde was a member of Parliament, part of the Axe Party. He was a libertarian. And he said to me several times when he's voting in the House, I always vote for the option that brings freedom. Right? That's what he said to me. And I would always say to him, but when you vote for freedom for one group, isn't there the possibility that it takes away freedom from another group? So what, and this is the example I was going to bring up. I mean, these guys are arguably, and I say arguably because I think there are many agendas going on at the moment within these protests around the world. They say that they're protesting for freedom. Yet at the same time that they're protesting for freedom, Wellington Central City is shut down. Businesses are closed. People are going under because they can't get in to get to the city. And their quote unquote freedom protest is actually causing business owners in this area to not be able to do what they've got the right to do, which is to open their businesses and, take an income and pay their staff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, long way of kind of saying when someone votes or chooses policies or ideas based around libertarianism and freedom, where is the line? Who decides where the line is? Who decides that freedom there is going to be what we push, even though it might impact that freedom there? And how does a libertarian weigh those things up? Because I'm sure even within the libertarian movement, there will be people talking about government intervention. There must be lines in there. Like there must be some who in America think that, money for the military is a good thing, and there'll be others that think that's the biggest waste of money from government intervention you can have. So, very long-winded question. I'm sorry about that, but sort of trying to figure out where's the line in libertarianism. Who decides where that line is when you're going to policy? How do you know, and how do you decide over whose freedoms we're going to support in the libertarian view?
Yeah. So I think most libertarians would say that when they're talking about freedom, they're talking about personal freedom equally distributed. So I think there's often a kind of misconception that freedom and equality are always going to be in tension or always going to be trade-offs. I think that that's kind of the wrong way to think about it. So when I'm looking at a public policy debate, I'm often asking just the very basic question, are people being treated equally under the law? And are we maximizing the amount of freedom that people have? So, in the case of COVID restrictions, I think, you might say, okay, there are some trade-offs here, right? If I'm a person who is immune compromised and I can't safely go out unless everybody takes a lot of precautions, a lot of mitigation. Everyone needs to wear a mask. Everyone has to be vaccinated. Only then can I safely go out. but at the same time, you're weighing the cost to that very, very large group of people of having to take these precautions, and they are not costless, right? I think there is this temptation to say, oh, it's easy, just wear a mask for 2 years. Oh, it's easy, just, eat outside for 2 years. Oh, it's easy, just, make sure that people are standing 6 feet apart in your business for 2 years. And I think that's actually wrong. Like, I think that there are very clearly some costs there, and they can be significant ones. I mean, you mentioned these truckers who are preventing people from accessing businesses in the city. But of course, the thing they're protesting is being prevented from doing their business, right? From practicing their business as they would like to see, as they would like to be allowed to do.
Yeah, it may not be the best example, because I don't actually think it's an anti-mandate protest. I think it's an anti-vaxxer protest, because there's a journalist who on a Facebook page the other day that he went to the Freedom rally where they didn't want to have people have to show papers, and he wasn't allowed to come into the property until they saw his papers, and then they turned him away. So I think it's a bit bigger than that. But yes, to your point.
And that actually is a big issue in the U.S. for these protests as well. We don't have a convoy exactly. The main one is in Canada, obviously, but the conflation between being anti-mandate and being anti-vax is unfortunate. I am very pro-vaccine. I am triple vaccinated. My family is triple vaccinated, but I'm against mandates. And I think it's, I think that there is a real distinction there. And it's unfortunate that people who are anti-vaccine are choosing to conflate that distinction. They understand that there's a much larger constituency of people who, even though they want to be considerate and they would respect, private property or a business saying, hey, you know what, I don't want you to come in here if you're not vaccinated. They just don't like the idea of the government deciding across the board for everyone. Those people are getting lumped in with people who think that Bill Gates is putting a microchip in their brain. And that's too bad, because I think one position is quite defensible and really deserves serious consideration, and one much, much less so. But
I think your point there is valid. And one of the reasons that these protests, and this one in particular, feels like an anti-vaccine protest is I think there are conversations to be had, whether people agree or disagree about the mandates. People can have that conversation, but so people like yourself, other people who are vaccinated up and mask wearing out in public because they want to make that choice. There are many people like that who are also think the mandates aren't good. But for example, at this protest, there's not a mask to be seen. So that says to me, it's not just about that. And also journalists are being attacked. Now, if you want to get your message out, journalists are a good place. So it feels like this particular protest is more about, there's several messages going out. The mandate might be one of them, but I don't think it's the loudest voice amongst this group in particular.
But I think, on your broader question of, what do you do about the fact that sometimes, people's desires are going to be in tension? To me, that's where you just have to set some very simple guidelines of, to agree on a framework. And, in the US, that framework is basically the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. We've sort of said, hey, here's where we think people's freedoms basically reside. And so that includes, you have the right to speak your mind. And we have a pretty clear agreement that includes saying stuff that offends people or even saying things that aren't true. That's speech rights that are defended. We say, hey, you have a right to your personal freedom. You can't be arrested without cause. You can't be deprived of your freedom. You have a right to your property. The government can't come take your property. Also, it's the government's responsibility to protect your property when other people try to take it. And I think you can make this basic list. Many libertarians just say, your freedoms end at the tip of my nose, right? Like that's one expression people say, that you do not have a right to use force or fraud against me. That's another term. But everything beyond that, feel free. Anything that's consensual should be allowed. That's another way of saying it. And I think those frameworks help you sort out, because there are always going to be costs and benefits. I don't think that anyone would say, a purely anarchic system will also be purely beneficial. Everyone will be happy, everyone will be free, and like our work here is done. But I think the more that you get in the business of trying to decide what is allowed in interactions where everyone is participating voluntarily, to me, that's the easiest place to say, you know what, government can just get out of that space. So that's sex, that's drugs, that's speech. And that's also, in the economic sphere, that's, if I own property, I should be allowed to do what I want on that property. I should be allowed to sell it to anyone I want to. I should be allowed to build on it. I should be allowed to trade my property. I should be allowed to, to develop it, to recombine it, and I think, I should be allowed to start a business. I should be, and I think that actually that's a bigger scope of personal liberty that the government is currently infringing on, that isn't protecting the liberties of others. The fact that I have to go and do hundreds of hours of training to get a cosmetology license to dye hair if I want to do it for money, but I can do this in my bathroom on my own for free and the government lets me, tells me that whatever is going on, whatever is happening there is not about safety and it's not about protecting the liberty of others. It's cronyism. It's, there's a financial element of it. There's gatekeeping, and that's something that we should be looking to eliminate.
Do you think that the truth is then that somewhere in between what you're talking about and what it currently is now is probably the best case scenario? So for example, the hair dyeing situation, I would be more comfortable if I knew someone had been through a how to do it properly session, health and safety. They weren't going to burn my hair with peroxide or my scalp or anything like that. So they'd had some kind of official, rather than, the market decides and I go in there once and they fuck it up and burn my scalp. But equally, I was thinking about, you're saying own property, build on it. And what about regulations around building? I mean, I think if we didn't have regulations around building, that people would cut every corner, spend as little as possible. And then you might have a property that you sell on that then the unknown, non-regulated work that is poor affects the next person. What about that kind of thing?
So I think both of those examples are very similar. Like, you are right to group those examples together. But to me, there's a third thing, which is the answer to both of those problems, which is reputation and which is non-governmental institutions. So I think there's a big difference between saying the government shouldn't have to license a hairdresser and saying there shouldn't be some way to get information about this hairdresser, right? I mean, you could say, okay, there's the National Society of Hairdressers, and they give all the hairdressers a rating. And the hairdressers who choose not to participate, you might assume they're kind of bad and not give them your business. We already see this already. If you buy stuff on Amazon, right? It has reviews. You don't need the government to tell you if this book is good. You go look on Amazon, you look at the reviews, and people have done that voluntarily. No force needed, no threat of jail needed, no threat of being fined by the government needed. And I think the same is true with the home building situation. Of course, there will be unscrupulous builders. There are unscrupulous builders now, even though there are lots of regulations. But there are 1,000 different mechanisms that you can imagine for pushing those people out of business that don't require the government. And I think people do such a good job of building those mechanisms that our lives are actually governed in all kinds of ways by reputational mechanisms, third-party recommendations, and just the threat of, restaurants go out of business because the word on the street is that they're bad and that someone saw a rat there. You don't need the government to do everything for everyone. And so I think you're right that those are problems that need solving. The place I think many people get it wrong is the government uniquely well suited to solve those problems? I would say not.
It's such a fascinating idea, because I think it's like many isms, even including things like, socialism, communism, capitalism, libertarianism, the isms, many isms at their purest sense, i.e., if you actually just look at the dictionary definition of what they are, I think seem to be, viable, workable entities. And what we do as human beings is we get involved and we fuck it up, because we are the failed part of the equation, maybe not the ism. And I'm not saying that that's to do with you personally, but I think about, I buy things off AliExpress. I don't know if you know what AliExpress is. AliExpress, Alibaba. And I tell you that all the reviews on there that are amazing, none of them will be genuine. But they're all amazing reviews, and all the product is always top-notch and amazing. And the other thing, so in other words, it's not using just that is not an accurate representation, I don't think, of necessarily the product. And the thing about the builders, I don't know how it works in America, obviously, but here in New Zealand, if I go to buy a house, I can go to my local council and get what they call the property bag. And if there's been an extension put on, in the property bag will be the resource consents and will be the plans and will be the explanation of where the plumbing's gone. And I can look that up. So, yes, there are unscrupulous builders, but I think the regulations on that one in particular is that gives me a recourse to go after them. And also because I got to tick some boxes, it gives me the ability when I'm going to buy a house or whatever to say, oh, there's been work done on this house. I'm going to go check the property bag to see if it's been done legitimately. Because if there's nothing in the property bag or there's nothing on the consent, then I go, well, this is unconsented work. How do I know? And then it becomes buyer beware, because then I'm going to get it, looked at by a inspector, or I go to the real estate agent. I'm not paying the price for that fifth bedroom, because even though there's 5 bedrooms, the fifth one is not consented. So therefore it shouldn't have the market value of the rest. But the only reason I'm able to do that is because of the paper trail from the consents. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, again, I think there are a bunch of other ways to build those sort of paper trails, right? We know things about people we do business with outside of the government all the time. And I think, those mechanisms are imperfect, but as you just noted, the government records are also imperfect. Stuff doesn't get recorded in there all the time. And again, to me, the countervailing force here, the thing that I think is under-considered is all of that government inspecting, record keeping, reporting, permission getting, permit gathering, that slows everything down and it makes everything more expensive. So if the thing that I ultimately care about is I want people to have safe housing that's affordable, that that is desirable for them, and that I understand people will want many different things, but my broad goal is I want people to have a place to live that they can afford. I think this elaborate system that we have built around zoning and permissions and permits and inspections that's done by the government, which does not specialize in this, governments are just only okay at this job, has made getting a house, has made having access to good, cheap housing harder. It has ended up moving against its own goals. And I think that, you could absolutely imagine a scenario where you have other people who do this better. And again, who do it all consensually, where people are just making deals, where they're doing it all on their own terms, and where you are not sometimes waiting 6 months for some guy in an office to stamp a piece of paper so that you can put a porch on your house. And I think that is the thing that people tend to kind of undervalue or underappreciate when you say hey, let's just imagine a world where the government doesn't do this thing. Yeah. You start to free up some resources and some time, and people are going to use that to make these goods more accessible, right? It's the same with the hairdresser. I have to pay a lot of money to get my hair dyed at a fancy salon. I would love something between the fancy salon and my janky job in my bathroom, but that's illegal. And so, of course, people sometimes do it illegally. They work in the gray market. That happens all the time. But we shouldn't put people who just want to dye hair in the position of breaking the law in order to do that. And I think the consequences for them can be very severe. Again, do we feel so strongly about this legal system that we're willing to jail people for violating it? This is a great example of absolutely not. No one should go to jail for messing up bleaching on your hair. And right now we are in a situation where that can happen and does happen.
It's really interesting. It's a really interesting conversation. Come here. Sorry, my dog just wants to come and say hello. You going to come up? Come on. Here we go.
Oh, star. Hi, buddy.
So it's a really interesting conversation. And it's one of those things we see right back in I'm prepared to change my mind on these things. It gives for some interesting thoughts in it. I do think about the idea. I mean, not to get stuck on housing. It'd be silly to be stuck on housing when it's really just one part of the broader question. But I do wonder if some of the things we're talking about, I don't think, I'm saying this naively, would ever be taken advantage of in that situation. But for a couple of reasons. One is I'm not vulnerable, and I have maybe more of the resource to be able to stay on top of it. I wonder in the housing situation that those kind of free market, buyer beware, without regulations. I wonder how that would impact a more vulnerable community, people who are desperate for housing, people who are looking for housing, and so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but that was my thought coming out of because I agree with you. I've got a friend, I had the conversation just the other day, who sold his house, bought a section. He thought he'd be in by the next Christmas, like 12 months later in his new house. 4 years later, haven't laid a foundation yet. So I get it. Part of that is also shortage of builders, but part of that is regulations and having to go through it. So I completely get it. I guess you got to then decide, don't you? You got to go, do I like what feels like a more secure system with more of a paper trail so I can ensure that it's safe and done to code? Or do I want it done more quickly and potentially take a bit of a risk that someone will cut a corner?
Right. Well, right now you're not.
You don't have that choice at the moment, but that would be
right now you're not allowed to choose that. Yeah. And the other element of this is, again, right now there are lots of people who live in not great housing or have no home at all. And those people are, at least in part, being shut out of the housing market because it is illegal to quickly build very cheap, relatively low quality housing, right? Like, that's one way of just saying all of our zoning, all of our building regulations, all of our licensure, what that adds up to is that functionally it's illegal to make low quality housing. Now, I get it. For me, I'm like, I want to live in a high quality house. But there are lots of people for whom the choice is not high quality house or low quality house. The choice is low quality house or no house. The choice is low quality house or homelessness. And that is those are real trade-offs. And I think we have unthinkingly built up a lot of our regulatory state, built up a lot of our kind of government interference in so many industries that we are putting people with fewer resources in a worse position in our attempt to protect them. We are actually just in the end denying them choices. And, sometimes in life, our choices aren't great. Sometimes we have to choose between not great and really not great. But it's, and I think, the flip side of my libertarian views is what I started out this conversation with, which is that I genuinely believe that global free markets are generating a tremendous amount of wealth, not just for people at the top, but for people at the bottom. And that's an undeniable fact of the last couple hundred years of history. And so if we want to help those people, another thing we can do is just kind of let that engine turn and not throw up barriers in the name of helping out poorer people, because we have done, there's an incredible story of the last couple hundred years, which is that if you let people buy and sell stuff and move around the world and trade ideas and speak freely and communicate, that generates a lot of wealth. And that is what is needed in so many places that are still very, very poor today.
Yeah. Yeah, when you said not great and really not great, I was wondering for a second if you were talking about the last two American elections, but
always. Look, I mean, every political choice is between not great and really not great. But that is our politics are a separate question from how we live our day-to-day life for most of us.
Katherine Mangu-Ward, editor-in-chief for Reason magazine. You're seeing if you're watching, you're seeing the website right now, reason.com, co-host of the Reason Roundtable podcast. This has been fun, man. I'm so thankful that you gave us some time to come on and have a chat with us at the bottom of the world here.
I was delighted to get a chance. I don't get to do too much New Zealand media, so this is an exciting opportunity for me.
Yeah, well, anytime. Love to have you back, but thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.